Good morning, Dan and Amy. So day two of the trial of the century. And, you're getting some of the highlights from the impeachment proceedings on the House side. Val Demings, who's a Democrat, one of the House managers, she brought Gordon Sondland back into the conversation, playing a clip from his testimony.
A lot of clips yesterday, a lot of video montages.
Yeah. Clips not to provide context, but to distort to distort what the testimony was, and that's what Val did with Sondland, playing one part, but not the exchanges you'll hear us play. Here's the argument that she made in part.
Chief Justice Roberts, senators, and counsel for the president. Now I want to talk to you about the White House meeting that President Trump offered to President Zelensky during their first phone call in April. But as you know, that meeting has not been scheduled. It was never scheduled. Ambassador Sondland testified that after the May 23rd meeting with President Trump, it became clear that President Zelensky would not be invited to the Oval Office until he announced the opening of investigations that would benefit President Trump's re-election. During his testimony, Ambassador Sondland stressed that it was a clear quid pro quo. Let's listen.
I know that members of this committee frequently frame these complicated issues in the form of a simple question. Was there a quid pro quo? As I testified previously, with regard to the requested White House call and the White House meeting, the answer is yes.
And then that same Gordon Sondland said this during testimony before the House.
But I believe I just asked him an open-ended question, Mr. Chairman. What do you want from Ukraine? I keep hearing all these different ideas and theories and this and that. What do you want? And it was a very short, abrupt conversation. He was not in a good mood. And he just said, I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing. Something to that effect.
So
but
there was a quid pro quo, and that Trump told him directly, I don't want anything. There is no quid pro quo.
But there is no quid pro quo on any of these articles of impeachment.
Well, that's true,
I mean,
too.
it's obstruction of Congress, and
that's true, too. And
that's another thing. They're talking about things that don't even matter.
There's something that Pat Cipollone said on the opening day that's, I think, really rings true and continues to present as true. Not only do you not have a case, you don't even have charges. And the Wall Street Journal editorial board opined on that last part of it, talking about the corrupt purposes impeachment, the standard for removing a president from office. The Journal Ed Board writes, the House managers don't assert that any specific action by the President Trump was an abuse of power or violation of the law. They don't deny he can delay a foreign aid to a country or aid to a foreign country or ask a foreign leader to investigate corruption. Presidents do that all the time. Instead, they assert in their first impeachment article that Mr. Trump is guilty of abuse of power because he committed those acts for corrupt purposes. The mind of President Trump. Think about this in the context of history and as president. Every president has made foreign policy decisions that he thinks may help his reelection. That's what President Obama did in 2012 when he asked Medvedev to tell Putin to ease up on missile defense until after the election. 21 Republican state attorney generals in a letter to the Senate on Wednesday made that point. Quote, it cannot be a legitimate basis to impeach a president for acting in a legal manner that may also be politically advantageous. Such a standard would be the cause for the impeachment of virtually every president, past, present, and future. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined again by David Drucker, senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner, WashingtonExaminer.com. David, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good to be here. Thank you.
So what about that? What about I guess I don't know why I'm even asking a question about the substance of the case, because this whole matter is really not about substance. It's about electoral politics. But the substance of the case with the two articles, the abuse of power and then the obstruction of Congress. The obstruction of Congress is borderline laughable, as has been outlined from the beginning with respect to the idea that a president can't assert his executive privilege. That wasn't Adam Schiff's position a half a dozen years ago when Obama asserted it on behalf of Eric Holder. Adam Schiff doesn't like the courts. But in terms of with their real cases, which that President Trump was trying to rig the 2020 election and dig up dirt on his opponent, and he's got all of these guilty motives, but they're not specific about it, as the Wall Street Journal opines. They're just talking about the abstraction of corrupt purposes.
Well, look, I mean, this is a major contention in the case, and this has been a major contention in the debate over impeachment from the beginning. The president, if you read the summary transcript of his call with Zelensky, asks Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden and his son. And Joe Biden happens to poll the best against him of any of the Democratic contenders and happens to be running against him and hopes to be the Democratic nominee against him in the 2020 presidential campaign. And Democrats have argued that the heart of this case is the president asking a foreign leader to dig up dirt on his opponent. And their argument is that goes beyond normal politicking. So if you have a problem with what the president did, and you look at it in that way, then the case is strong. If you think that a president asking a foreign leader to dig up dirt on a potential opponent in the next election is above board, then you don't have a problem. What I would tell you is that I talked to a lot of Republicans early in the impeachment inquiry that didn't like what the president did, told me they wouldn't have done it, told me they wished he didn't do it, told me it was unseemly, told me it was problematic, but that they didn't think it rose to the level of an impeachable offense. And over time, the public position of most Republicans was that the president did nothing wrong. But I know that it is something that privately bothers them and is not something they would have done, with the clear implication is because it shouldn't have been done. But again, the way the American public looks at this is if you're going to convict and remove a president from office, there's a high bar. This is a political exercise by its very nature. It's a political remedy to deal with a president potentially, oversteps his bounds in some manner or another. And we've seen in polls where the president's disapproval number is higher than the level of support for convicting and removing him from office, which gets us back to how the public is very cautious about impeachment. And that's the whole point, because if you're going to remove a president before the next election, in theory, it needs to have popular support. So when members of Congress look at the public and determine that they don't think there's enough support from voters, they're cautious about acting. And that's what we've seen, at least with Republicans who are responding to their own voters, even though Democrats are also responding to their voters.
What did you make of Schiff's 2.5-hour, I don't know what you want to call it, presentation where he had videotape of Trump and administration members making comments about things that, don't sit right with some people? For example, candidate Trump calling for the Russians to hack into Hillary Clinton's emails, asking Ukraine and China. Do you think it was effective at all? And Schiff said that he did that because he thought that some senators in the room had never seen any of these video montages.
Well, I agree that a lot of senators never saw this stuff. Why? They're doing their job all day. I mean, they had committee hearings, they had meetings, they had to vote, they had things to do, and they couldn't sit in front of the television like I did on various days. That was my job to do and watch this stuff. I think that Adam Schiff made the best possible case he could make, and I think that he has a constituency, meaning Democratic voters across the country that don't like Trump, that want Democrats to make a strong case. And I thought his case was strong, but it's not up to me to decide whether it's effective. I don't think it was ineffective, and I think he made a very logical case if you're looking at it from his point of view. I just think that most Republicans know the broad contours of the case, even if they don't know a lot of the specifics, and minds have already been made up. By the way, I think minds have been made up on the Democratic side, too. I think there are Democratic senators that also have jobs to do, probably didn't see this stuff before, at least in this kind of specificity, but have already, drawn conclusions because they know the broad contours of the case. So I think what Schiff's job is, from his point of view, then is to try and make the best case he can for the general public that'll read about this and see news reports about this. And I think he did a fine job, and I don't think, there are necessarily holes in his case. What I would say is that he has been such a partisan actor from the beginning that it hurts his ability to win converts.
Well, I would say a couple of other things about his case. One, most importantly, and this is the point that Andy McCarthy makes about this impeachment generally, if your case is strong, you don't have to engage in the histrionics and the gamesmanship and the overheated rhetoric that Pelosi, Schiff, Nadler have engaged in. And two, the evidence to support Andy McCarthy's point is that Adam Schiff is a pathological liar. I mean, you could call it artistic license if you like his fictional conversation between Trump and Zelensky. But when Adam Schiff says that President Trump has pushing and his team is pushing the conspiracy that the Russians didn't hack the 2016 election, the Ukrainians did, that's a lie. President Trump has specifically said on numerous occasions, I believe my intelligence community that the Russians attempted to hack the election, attempted to interfere with the election. I don't think it affected the outcome, but I believe them. And I believe that maybe other people did too. And there was a political story in 2017 about Ukrainian actors potentially trying to do that. So Adam Schiff knows that's a lie. His whole just move on riff yesterday, he knows is a lie as well. As Chris Wallace pointed out, the context of the Mick Mulvaney statement that he was using, purposely misinterpreting it so that he could go on one of his Jeremiads. So, I mean, Adam Schiff, this whole he presented a good case, the best case he can present. Well, sure, if you're just going to make something up to connect dots that don't otherwise connect, it's going to sound a lot better than having to actually produce the evidence to support your claims. The way that he spent 2 years saying, I have the president dead to rights on Russian collusion. We have smoking gun evidence of Russian collusion that was never presented. This guy for 3 years has been a pathological liar, and it's a little bit disconcerting to see people inside the Beltway sanitizing his conduct.
Well, look, I think you're expounding on a point I was making, is I think Schiff has hurt his credibility over the past few years because he was constantly going on television suggesting there was more evidence to tie Trump to personally having colluded with the Russians to defeat Clinton than existed. So that has hurt his credibility. And I think that has been a problem in him as an advocate in trying to make this case. But if we're discussing the facts of the case, there are disagreements about the facts of this case. But I don't necessarily think it's a non-existent case. I think there are just disagreements over whether the president did something wrong or whether the president did something that rises to the level of an impeachable offense. But I think that the House Democrats would have been a lot more effective potentially in their argument if the people that were making the arguments had been sticking to the facts all the way through. Look, I think part of the issue the president has dealt with at the same time is that he has alternately embraced the intelligence community's assessment that the Russians meddled in the election and alternately questioned it. And what we know is that while, others, played around a little bit, and we know, some Ukrainians played around a little bit, nobody tried to meddle in the election. Nobody meddled with the systemic strength that the Russians did. And all the president had to do to probably save himself a whole lot of grief a few years ago was just say, I know they meddled. It actually happened on my predecessor's watch. I'm going to try and do something about it. I don't think it affected the election, but nobody should do that, and I'm going to take care of this. And he probably would be in a lot better shape with a lot more voters. At the same time, if Adam Schiff and House Democrats wanted to be effective, they shouldn't have been claiming for a couple of years that they had all sorts of evidence that they never had. It makes them look bad. It makes them look not credible, especially when you're trying to convince a lot of independents and swing voters that you've got the goods on Trump. These are all a bunch of different arguments that are connected but not necessarily the same as we're dealing with what's being argued before the Senate today.
Schumer and Sanders et al. Said yesterday, we're not going to do any witness trade, Bolton for Biden. Is there any move by McConnell and Republicans who had the position of wanting to move this along expeditiously? Is there any reconsideration that perhaps we should give Democrats exactly what they want, witnesses, because it's what they actually don't want? They just want an argument they can use for the next 10 months after we acquit?
So I don't think there are 51 Republican votes for a lot of these witnesses, and I think that's part of the issue. And I think a lot of Republicans, after going through, if you've seen how this has unfolded over the past few days, by the time they get deep into next week. I just think the appetite to keep going for another couple of weeks, which is what it would take when you start voting to hear from witnesses and hearing arguments, additional arguments, and all of that, this would stretch out ad infinitum. And I think that this whole exercise is going to drive everybody crazy, and they're just going to want to be done. Part of it is because everybody knows that unless something radically changes, which nobody expects, there are not the votes to convict and remove the president.
He is. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So you can keep on going here, but it's not going to get to any conclusion. I think there are not necessarily, if there were 51 Republican votes for any particular witness and a strong desire to hear from that witness, Republicans have the votes on their own to call them. And I just don't think the votes generally exist. Some don't want to call any witnesses. Some want to call some, but not others. So I still, leave open a possibility that people who testified in the House could be called. Or maybe the one exception is John Bolton, but I tend to think we're going to end up hearing from zero witnesses.
He is David Drucker, senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner, WashingtonExaminer.com. David, thanks as always for being with us. Appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you.
Thanks.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
The Lou Dobbs Financial Report is brought to you by Signature Bank, helping local businesses succeed. Visit signaturebank.bank for your commercial banking needs.
I'm Lou Dobbs. General Motors to spend $3.5 billion in Michigan. America and France reaching a deal to avoid a trade dispute. Those stories next. Let's talk about your 401k for a moment. If it's in the stock market, it's not necessarily safe. Remember the great financial crisis of 2008? Lou Dobbs here. Take a look at what the folks at Gold